The day I came home and saw sunlight pouring into my backyard where it had never reached before, I knew something was wrong. Not the kind of wrong where a storm knocks down a branch or a neighbor accidentally backs into your mailbox. I mean the kind of wrong that makes your stomach drop before your brain has even figured out what happened. For massive oak trees, trees that had stood behind my house longer than I'd probably been alive, were gone. Nothing remained except fresh stumps and piles of sawdust, and through the gap I could suddenly see straight across the golf course behind my property. In that moment I realized somebody hadn't made a mistake. Somebody had gotten exactly what they wanted. My name is Ryan Mercer, and this happened just outside Greenville, South Carolina. About 8 years ago, my wife Emily and I bought what we thought would be our forever home. It wasn't a mansion, it wasn't on a lake, and it certainly wasn't the biggest house in the neighborhood, but it had one thing we both loved the second we saw it: privacy. The backyard backed up to a private golf course, but what separated our property from the course wasn't a fence. It was a line of enormous oak trees. They created a natural wall between us and the golfers. They blocked noise, created shade during the brutal South Carolina summers, and made our backyard feel like a completely separate world. Every evening after work I'd sit on the deck with a glass of iced tea and watch the sun disappear through those branches. Emily used to tease me that I cared more about those trees than I cared about most people. Maybe she wasn't entirely wrong. Life stayed pretty quiet for years. The golf course behind us wasn't particularly busy. Most of the members were retirees, local business owners, and people who liked spending half a day chasing a little white ball around. Then everything changed when the course was purchased by a development company called Fairmont Land Partners. Almost overnight construction crews appeared everywhere. New landscaping, new irrigation systems, new clubhouse renovations. Luxury homes were being planned around the course. Millions of dollars were being poured into the property. At first I didn't think much about it. Developers buy things and change them. That's what they do. But after a few months I started noticing something. Everything they built seemed designed for one purpose: selling expensive homes. The golf course itself had become a giant marketing tool. One Saturday morning I was trimming hedges near my driveway when a black SUV pulled up. A man stepped out wearing expensive clothes that looked more appropriate for a corporate boardroom than a construction site. He walked over with the kind of smile that felt practiced. "Ryan Mercer?" he asked. "That's me." He introduced himself as Brandon Holloway, project manager for Fairmont. We shook hands and made small talk for a few minutes. The weather, the neighborhood, the renovations. Then he casually pointed toward the rear of my property. "Those are some beautiful trees back there." I nodded. "One of the main reasons I bought the house." His smile tightened slightly. "Actually, that's something I wanted to discuss." There it was, the real reason he'd shown up. Brandon explained that the company was building a new premium championship tee box directly behind my property. According to him, it would become one of the signature locations on the entire course. Then he mentioned that the oak trees blocked most of the view. I remember staring at him for a second before saying, "Okay." He laughed politely. "Well, some homeowners have been willing to cooperate when improvements benefit the community." It was one of those statements that sounds harmless until you actually listen to what the person is saying. I crossed my arms. "Those trees are on my property." "Absolutely," he said immediately. "We understand that." "Good. Of course, if you ever wanted to discuss options." "There aren't any options." For the first time I saw a tiny crack in his salesman personality. Just a split second of annoyance before the smile returned. "Fair enough," he said. "Just thought I'd ask." Then he got back into his SUV and drove away. Emily came outside a few minutes later and asked what he wanted. I pointed toward the golf course and said, "He wants my trees." She laughed. "Good luck with that." Honestly, I felt the same way. The trees were mine. The property line was clear. The discussion was over. Or at least I thought it was. For the next few weeks life returned to normal. Work got busy. Summer arrived. Emily and I planned a long weekend getaway in the mountains. Just 3 days away from home. 3 quiet days hiking, relaxing, and forgetting about deadlines. Then we came home Sunday evening. The second I stepped out of the truck something felt different. The backyard looked brighter. At first I couldn't figure out why. Then I walked onto the deck and froze. The shade was gone. For massive oak trees had disappeared. Fresh stumps sat in the dirt where they had stood for decades. Emily stopped beside me and whispered, "Oh my God." I couldn't even answer. Beyond the opening I could see golfers moving across the fairway. And directly behind the gap sat a brand new elevated tee box with a perfectly unobstructed view straight across my property. Exactly the view Brandon Holloway had wanted. Exactly the view I'd refused to give him. Standing there looking at those stumps, I felt something colder than anger settle into my chest. Because deep down, before I spoke to a single person, before I saw a single document, before I gathered a single piece of evidence, I already knew this wasn't an accident. And before the sun set that evening, I made a promise to myself. Whoever had done this was about to learn that cutting down my trees was going to become the most expensive landscaping decision of their entire career. The next morning I woke up before sunrise. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes I saw those stumps sitting behind my house like a reminder that somebody had walked onto my property and taken something they had no right to touch. Emily found me standing at the kitchen window holding a coffee mug and staring into the backyard. "You're going to figure it out," she said. "I know. Just don't do anything stupid." I laughed. "You married me. You know I don't do stupid." She raised an eyebrow. "You do, stubborn." Fair point. By 8 o'clock, I was walking across the course toward the maintenance yard. A few workers were loading equipment into utility carts when I arrived. Most of them looked uncomfortable the second I started asking questions. Finally, one older guy named Carl pulled me aside. "Look," he said quietly, "I don't know exactly who approved it, but the order came from management. We were told the trees were part of the course boundary cleanup project. Did anyone verify ownership?" I asked. He shook his head. "Not that I know of." "Did anyone ask permission?" Another shake of the head. That was all I needed to hear. Back home, I pulled out every document from my closing paperwork. Survey maps, property records, easement documents, everything. 2 hours later, I found the original survey. The property line wasn't even close. The trees had been clearly inside my boundary, not inches from the line, several feet inside it. Whoever authorized the removal couldn't claim confusion, but I wanted more than assumptions. I wanted proof. The next day, I hired a licensed surveyor named Ethan Brooks. Ethan had spent nearly 30 years settling property disputes. When he arrived, he looked at the stumps, looked at the survey, then laughed. "Well, somebody's about to have a bad week." 2 days later, bright orange survey stakes marked every corner of my property. Ethan walked me through the measurements personally. Every stump sat well inside my land. Not one tree had been remotely questionable. He handed me a written report and said, "If this ends up in court, this will be useful." That sentence stayed in my head. If this ends up in court. At that point, I still thought this was probably going to become a lawsuit. What I didn't realize was that the real leverage wasn't sitting in my backyard. It was buried inside a county permit office. A few days later, I started researching the construction project itself. The new tee box had required county approval because it changed grading and drainage patterns near residential property. Most people would never think to look at permit documents. Luckily, I spent 15 years working in commercial insurance claims. I learned long ago that paperwork tells stories people don't want told. After several hours digging through public records, I found the approval package. Then I found the document that changed everything. One condition of approval required the golf course to maintain an existing vegetative safety buffer between residential lots and the new tee box. I read the sentence 3 times. Then a 4th. Then I smiled. The county hadn't approved the tee box alone. They had approved the tee box with the tree line. The trees weren't just landscaping anymore. They were part of the safety plan. Remove the trees, and the project no longer complied with its permit. Suddenly, this wasn't just about property damage. This was about a violation that could shut down a multi-million-dollar development project. For the first time since seeing the stumps, I felt something close to optimism. The following morning, I filed a formal complaint with the county planning department. I attached the survey report, photos of the stumps, property records, copies of the permit conditions. Then I waited. 5 days later, 2 county inspectors arrived. One was a senior planner named Lisa Harmon. The other was an engineering compliance officer named Greg Nolan. They spent nearly 3 hours documenting everything, measuring distances, reviewing surveys, taking photographs. Greg stood next to one of the stumps and looked back toward the new tee box. Then he looked at me. "How often do balls come into your yard?" "Almost never before." He nodded. "And now?" Before I could answer, a golf ball landed 50 feet away near my deck. We all turned toward the sound. Nobody said anything for several seconds. Lisa actually laughed. "Well, that answers that question. They walked onto the course and spent another hour inspecting the tee box. 3 days later, I received a phone call. The county had determined that the removal of the trees violated permit conditions. Effective immediately, the new premium tee box was placed under a stop-use order pending corrective action. I remember sitting at my kitchen table reading the notice twice, just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. Millions of dollars had been invested into the redevelopment. Marketing brochures had already featured the new hole. Real estate agents were using drone footage of it to sell luxury lots. And now one of their flagship attractions was officially shut down. Word spread fast. Within a week, golfers were complaining. Residents were asking questions. Potential buyers touring the development wanted to know why the showcase tee box was covered with warning signs and yellow barriers. Then came the knock at my door. I opened it and found Brandon Holloway standing there. Gone was the confident salesman from a month earlier. He looked tired. "Can we talk?" he asked. I stepped outside. "Sure." Brandon glanced toward the golf course before speaking. "There appears to have been a misunderstanding." I almost laughed. A misunderstanding. For mature oak trees don't accidentally disappear because of a misunderstanding. "Really?" I asked. "The landscaping contractor apparently believed the trees were outside your property line." "Funny. The survey says otherwise." He shifted uncomfortably. "We're willing to make this right." "How?" "We can plant replacement trees." "What kind?" "Smaller ornamental trees would establish quickly." I stared at him. "You cut down mature oaks that were older than both of us combined, and you're offering ornamental trees." Brandon sighed. "We're trying to find a practical solution." "No," I said. "You're trying to find a cheap solution." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he finally asked the question he had come to ask. "What exactly do you want?" I had been waiting for that. I walked inside, grabbed a folder, and handed it to him. Inside was a proposal from a landscape restoration company. For mature oak trees. Large caliper transplant installation. Reinforced root stabilization systems. Long-term maintenance guarantees. Everything required to recreate the original buffer as closely as possible. Brandon opened the estimate and nearly choked when he saw the number. "You're serious?" "Completely. This costs a fortune. So did my trees." He kept flipping through the paperwork. Then I handed him another document. This one made him even more nervous. "What's this?" he asked. "A fence proposal." "Fence. 20-foot protective barrier. Installed entirely on my property." His face changed immediately. Because he understood what I understood. Without the trees, golf balls were now entering my yard regularly. Under local regulations, I had every right to build a protective structure to protect my property and family. A 20-foot barrier would completely block the view from the premium tee box. It would effectively destroy the exact attraction they had cut down my trees to create in the first place. Brandon looked toward the course, then back at me. "You'd actually build this?" I shrugged. "I don't particularly want to. But I also don't enjoy golf balls landing next to my grill." The truth was I could practically see the math happening inside his head. The cost of replacing my trees versus the financial disaster of leaving that tee box closed, and the even bigger disaster if I installed a giant fence. For the first time since this started, Brandon realized he wasn't negotiating from a position of power anymore. And as he stood there silently staring at those documents, I could tell he was beginning to understand something his company should have figured out before they ever touched a chainsaw. They thought they were dealing with a homeowner. What they were actually dealing with was someone who had finally found the leverage they never expected him to have. Brandon left that afternoon carrying both proposals under his arm, and for the first time since this whole mess started, I honestly wasn't sure what would happen next. Part of me expected lawyers. Part of me expected threats. Developers don't usually like being cornered, especially when they've already spent millions on a project. But what happened over the following week told me everything I needed to know. They knew they were wrong. 3 days later, my phone rang while I was mowing the lawn. It was Brandon. His voice sounded very different from the man who had shown up at my driveway a month earlier talking about community improvements and premium views. "Ryan, we've reviewed your proposal." I shut off the mower. And there was a long pause. "We're prepared to move forward." I actually smiled. "With which part?" Another pause. "All of it." 2 weeks later, the restoration company arrived with equipment I didn't even know existed. Massive trucks rolled into the neighborhood carrying mature oak trees that looked like they belonged in a park rather than on a flatbed trailer. Neighbors came outside to watch. People stopped walking their dogs and stood on the sidewalk taking pictures. One elderly neighbor who had lived there longer than anyone else walked over and shook my hand. "I thought you'd never get those trees back." "Honestly," I said, "so did I." The installation process took days. Root balls the size of small cars were carefully lowered into place. Support systems were installed underground. Irrigation lines were added. Protective netting was erected along portions of the golf course side to satisfy county safety requirements. It wasn't identical to what I'd lost. Nothing could truly replace decades of growth overnight. But it was close. Much closer than I ever expected. Then came the final piece. County inspectors returned to review the work. They measured everything, inspected the buffer, reviewed the restoration plan. A week later, the stop use order was officially lifted. The tee box reopened. Golfers returned. Construction resumed. Life slowly settled down again. But the story wasn't quite over. About a month later, I ran into Brandon near the clubhouse. It was the first time we'd spoken since the agreement. He looked exhausted. We exchanged an awkward nod before he finally said, "You know, this ended up costing us a lot more than just replacing the trees." I figured. He laughed quietly. "You have no idea." Then he started listing things. Project delays, county penalties, contractor disputes, marketing problems, lost sales appointments, emergency redesign meetings, internal investigations. The number was staggering. What started with 4 trees had turned into a financial headache that rippled through the entire development. Before leaving, Brandon looked toward the new tree line and said something interesting. "You know, if somebody had just listened to you at the beginning, none of this would have happened." I looked at him and smiled. That's usually how these stories work. He laughed, shook his head, and walked away. Looking back now, the part that still amazes me isn't that they cut down my trees. People make bad decisions all the time. What amazes me is how often powerful people convince themselves that ownership only matters when it's theirs. Somewhere in a conference room, somebody decided my property was an obstacle. Somebody looked at those trees and saw nothing more than something standing in the way of a better view and a more profitable brochure. What they failed to understand was that property rights work both ways. The same laws that protected their development protected my backyard too. The same permits they relied on to build their project became the permits that stopped it. And the same view they wanted so badly almost ended up blocked by a 20-foot fence because they couldn't respect a property line. Today the new oaks are thriving. They're taller every year. The privacy is coming back. The shade is returning. Sometimes when I sit on my deck in the evening, I can hear golfers talking near that tee box. Most of them have no idea why those trees are there. Most of them have no idea an entire development project nearly stalled because somebody got greedy with a chainsaw. And honestly, that's fine with me, because the people who needed the lesson learned it the expensive way. But here's the question I've always wondered about. If the county permit hadn't existed, if I hadn't found that one condition buried inside all that paperwork, would they have ever taken responsibility? Or would they have simply gotten away with it? That's what I'd love to hear from you. Do you think the company would have done the right thing without being forced? Or do you think the only reason they fixed the problem was because they got caught with real consequences? Let me know down in the comments. If you've ever dealt with a neighbor, HOA, developer, or business that thought the rules didn't apply to them, share your story too. And if you enjoyed this one, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because sometimes the most satisfying victories don't come from getting even. They come from knowing exactly which rule the other side forgot to read.